Welcome to Sleepy Historian, where old tales whisper by candlelight, and memories gently drift into dreams. Tonight, let us journey back to a time long asleep in history. Hypatia was not only a victim of fanaticism, she was a symbol of light. In a time of deep darkness, her death serves as a quiet reminder of the true worth of knowledge and of independent thought. Her legacy still lives on, inspiring generation after generation of those who love truth and who dare to seek it. Imagine yourself walking along the cobbled streets of Alexandria. Beneath the gentle glow of oil lamps hanging from wooden porches, the Mediterranean breeze whispers past, carrying the scent of sea salt and the soft rustle of papyrus scrolls. This is a city of knowledge, once home to the great library of Alexandria, a beacon of human wisdom. But now, the winds are shifting. Division and zealotry begin to cloud its skies. And there, amid the quiet of the night, a woman appears. She walks slowly, cloaked in a robe of ash gray. Her face is calm, and her eyes, they shine like the stars she watches through her telescope. This is Hypatia, not a noblewoman, not a priest, but a philosopher, a rare thing, and rarer still a woman of reason, in a world of unrest. Hypatia was born around the year 355 AD, in the final centuries of the Roman Empire. At this time, Alexandria was more than just a place of learning. It had become a battleground between the rising Christian faith and the ancient Greek-Roman traditions. In the heart of this storm, she continued, teaching, writing, debating, not for power, but for truth. Under the pale moonlight, her voice rises gently in the museum. Not a museum as we know it, but a gathering place for great minds. Her students came from many lands: Greek, Roman, Egyptian, even followers of the new religion. She welcomed all, so long as they came to learn. Hypatia did not live in illusions. She knew the world was changing, and knowledge is not always met with gratitude. But still, she chose to walk that path, for she believed that even the faintest light of reason could pierce the deepest darkness. Let us return to the past. Before Hypatia became a symbol of wisdom, she was just a young girl, learning under the guidance of a remarkable father, Theon. He was not only a respected mathematician and astronomer, but also the one who planted the first seeds of reason in his daughter's heart. Theon was a lecturer at the Museum of Alexandria, a scholar devoted to ancient texts, to the works of Euclid, Ptolemy, and Aristotle. But he did not keep that knowledge to himself. From an early age, Hypatia was introduced to the rigorous disciplines: geometry, logic, astronomy, and music, the four pillars of classical education. Inside their modest home, where candlelight flickered and cast long shadows over papyrus scrolls, father and daughter would talk for hours about the movements of the stars, the patterns in equations, and the nature of reality itself. Hypatia was not raised to be a bride. She was trained to be a philosopher. Theon taught her not just how to think, but how to question, a skill far more precious than knowing any answer. Hypatia learned quickly. Soon, she moved beyond the basic lessons, reinterpreting ancient ideas with clarity, creativity, and sharpness. In Greco-Roman society, such a thing was rare. Women were often left out of intellectual life. But Hypatia, thanks to her father, was allowed to step through that closed door, not only as a gifted student, but as a true heir to the spirit of enlightenment. The story of Hypatia began with love, not romantic love, but a love for knowledge. And from that love, she would one day rise beyond her father's shadow, shining like a torch. In a darkening age, night falls over the main square of Alexandria. Footsteps echo faintly across marble columns, as students in simple cloaks quietly make their way into the lecture hall. There is no music, no grand procession, only a voice, clear, calm, and strangely, the voice of a woman. Hypatia was not just a scholar. She was a teacher, and above all, she was a natural speaker. Her lectures, whether held at the museum or in her own home, became legend among the learned circles. By the shimmer of oil lamps, she drew spirals on wax boards, explaining the orbits of planets, guiding her students through the depths of Aristotle's logic and Plato's thought. She did not simply recite the words of her forebears. She questioned, she reinterpreted, and she brought old knowledge to life again. With extraordinary patience, Hypatia turned the dry works of astronomy and mathematics into a kind of rhythma song, where each number held a soul, and each idea became a star in the sky of the mind. Her students came from many paths. Some were children of noble families, some were Christians, some would one day become leaders in government. Among them was Synesis, who would become a Christian bishop, yet always honored her as a great teacher. The most unforgettable part was not the knowledge she gave, but the way she made others want to understand. No threats, no judgments, just curiosity, like a soft breeze in the Egyptian summer. In a world closing in with fear and suspicion, Hypatia stood as a living bridge between religions, between classes, between the past and what is still to come. The night in Alexandria is still, but inside the academy, her voice echoes like a distant bell, a reminder that thought is something no one can ever take away. Beneath the quiet facade of Alexandria by night, there are tremors one cannot see. The very stones beneath Hypatia's feet begin to record a silent shift, a fracture between two worlds, the world of classical knowledge and the world of rising faith. By the 4th and 5th centuries AD, Christianity was no longer an oppressed belief. It had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. New emperors no longer supported the Greek philosophical schools. Instead, bishops, cathedrals, and a new belief system began to reshape every value. In Alexandria, always a city of many peoples and faiths, tension grew stronger each day. Christians, Jews, and followers of the old Greco-Roman gods no longer looked at each other with curiosity, but with suspicion and fear. What began as scattered unrest slowly turned to bloodshed. Hypatia, though unaffiliated with any religion, could not escape the storm. She still taught. Her doors were still open. Her students still came from every belief. But now, the eyes watching her were not only respectful. Some held doubt, and even envy. A woman, daring to lecture to men, praised by both believers and non-believers alike. To some, this was intolerable. Meanwhile, Alexandria's new bishop Cyril moved to strengthen Christian control. All traces of ancient faiths were condemned as heresy. Scholars were silenced, temples were emptied, and slowly, the space for reasoned debate was replaced by sermons of unquestioning belief. Hypatia remained silent, calm. She took no side except that of truth. But the night in Alexandria was no longer still. The whispers in the wind had become heavy footsteps. A storm was drawing near. A windy evening along the coast of Alexandria. Dark waves lapped gently against the rocks, while inside the city, a silent war unfolds, not on the battlefield, but within the minds of men. This is a struggle between rulers, between belief and power, between truth and fear. Orestes, Roman governor of Alexandria, was once a student and friend of Hypatia, a Greek by heritage. He now stood between two forces, Rome's authority and the growing power of the Christian bishop. At that perilous crossroads, Orestes often sought Hypatia's counsel, not just for philosophy, but for wisdom. Hypatia was no politician, but she understood human nature and the dangers of emotion overtaking reason. She always urged Orestes toward reconciliation, yet never hesitated to defend her ideals when needed. Their closeness began to stir unease. Among the more extreme Christian factions, they could not accept that a woman might influence politics, unless she used sorcery or something unholy. Rumors began to spread. Hypatia, they said, was a witch, a pagan, a barrier to the city's peace. With her dangerous knowledge, In truth, Hypatia did not oppose Christianity, but she did not glorify it either. She stood as a symbol of a fading era, a time when people still dared to question. And in the night, when whispers grew into murmurs echoing across the square, Hypatia could feel the shift. This was no longer about ideas. Now, there was the scent of violence, of judgment, and of a crowd searching for someone to blame. The city of Alexandria, once the shining center of ancient wisdom, was no longer a home to reason and scholarship. Philosophical debates had grown rare, replaced by public preaching, by chants, and by curses. Faith, no longer a quiet refuge for the soul, had become a weapon, held tightly in the fists of the fanatical. On stone walls, names were smeared with charcoal. Among them, Hypatia. They called her a witch, a bearer of unnatural power, an enemy of the Lord. In a world shedding its old skin, a woman who stood tall, independent, respected by scholars and rulers alike, became intolerable to those who craved absolute control. Cyril, the Bishop of Alexandria, did not speak the order aloud, but he did not hide his hatred for those who represented the old world, and Hypatia, with her knowledge, her freedom, and her influence, became a symbol that must be erased. In her final days, she still taught, still walked through the city streets, her face calm, though eyes followed her with suspicion and contempt. Perhaps she knew that something was coming, but like a true philosopher, she did not turn away. Then, one morning in March of 415, as the sun was just beginning to rise, a group appeared. They were called the Parabolani, fervent followers of faith. They stopped her chariot, dragged her into an abandoned church. There was no dialogue, no logic, only screaming and frenzy. They tore away her clothing. They cut her with sharp shards of tile. No one intervened. There was no trial, no law. The last philosopher of Alexandria was murdered, not for crime, but for daring to think. That night, Alexandria fell into heavy silence. No one spoke, but all knew a torch of wisdom had been snuffed out, and that darkness would last for centuries. The sea breeze drifts through the empty streets of Alexandria, carrying the salt of the Mediterranean, and something stranger still, an absence. There are no more lectures echoing from the academy. No groups of students gathered beneath the marble columns. The death of Hypatia was not only the loss of a person, but the end of an age. After her passing, the ancient city was no longer the capital of knowledge it had once been. Scholars left, papyrus scrolls were abandoned, and what had been the heart of reason now pulsed with fear. No one dared to question anymore. No one believed that truth could be reached through pure reason. Orestes, the Roman governor, her friend and former student, gradually disappeared from politics. No one knows if he died, was killed, or quietly reassigned. He left behind a city that no longer had the courage to ask, "What is right?" For those who committed the murder, no punishment was ever declared. The Parabolani remained, still seen as a religious escort. Cyril, the Bishop of Alexandria, though criticized by some within the church, went on to consolidate even greater power. Later, he would be declared a saint. History has moments where silence says more than words. The death of Hypatia was one of them. There were no statues raised in her honor, no grand announcement of mourning, only whispers, passed quietly, from teacher to student. They spoke of a flame that had gone out, and of the darkness that had just begun to fall. At night, the streets of Alexandria felt different. The marble columns and ancient domes still stood, but the soul was missing, and somewhere in the dark, there were still those who remembered and mourned the woman who dared to stand tall in the whirlwind of history. The night in Alexandria continued to flow, but it was no longer a center of knowledge. The walls of the academy slowly grew moss, scrolls were hidden or burned, and yet Hypatia, erased from reality, began to awaken. In memory, Her students, like Synesis now, a bishop, wrote letters, speaking of their former teacher, in voices filled with quiet reverence. He never described her death in detail, but between his words, one could feel a deep sorrow, as if he knew an entire era had ended when she fell. In the centuries that followed, her name became a whisper, a mystery. Some called her a witch, some a martyr for knowledge, and some quietly copied what little remained of her work. In any form, Hypatia was never truly forgotten. During the Renaissance, over 1,000 years later, as Europe slowly awakened from the long slumber of the Middle Ages, Western scholars uncovered ancient texts and found her name. They called her humanity's first female philosopher and the last beacon of Alexandria. In dark monastery rooms, the light of Hypatia's life was rekindled, not to guide students, but to awaken history. Her death became a symbol, not only of fanatic cruelty, but of the courage of thought. She never carried a sword. She never held power. Her only weapon was reason, and with that reason, she stood tall until the very end. In every book, every story, every painting made long after Hypatia appears, a quiet figure in the dark, the woman who lived and died for the belief that thought is sacred. The night passed, and Hypatia was no longer just a name lost in the shadows of Alexandria. From the 17th century onward, as the world slowly rediscovered science and reason, her image returned, not only as a figure of history, but as a symbol. Philosophers and writers began to speak of her as a heroine of intellect. In a world where women were still pushed from the halls of learning, Hypatia became living proof that knowledge knows no gender. In paintings, on stages, even in film, artists tried to capture her spirit, a wise, noble, solitary woman, standing in the winds of history. In Spain, in England, in France, lands once bound tightly by dogma, her name was spoken again, this time with reverence. Mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, no single title could hold the fullness of who she was. She became a metaphor for all those brave enough to ask questions in a world that demanded silence. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as women began to demand their rights, the name Hypatia rose again. She became a symbol of academic freedom, of enlightened thought, of the right to think for oneself. Female scientists looked to her as an unrecognized pioneer, a flickering light guiding them through a world that once closed its doors to them. In today's classrooms, where astronomy, geometry, and philosophy are taught, her name still echoes, not as a forgotten chapter, but as a reminder that the courage to think, to teach, to question, will always matter. Hypatia, who died in silence, now speaks more than 1,000 lectures. Beneath the night sky that still covers ancient Alexandria, the storyteller stops before an old dome, once filled with voices of knowledge, now home only to the whispering sea breeze. And yet, even if the walls collapse, even if the manuscripts burn to ash, the light of Hypatia was never truly extinguished. She left no grand book behind, no philosophical school that bears her name. All that remains are scattered lines, ideas remembered only because others mentioned them. But what made her eternal was not the quantity of knowledge. It was the spirit that inspired generations to come. Hypatia lived through chaos, an empire breaking apart, a world ruled by fear and blind belief. And still, she chose the hardest path, to think, to question, to love the truth. Not through power, not through violence, but with wisdom and quiet dignity. She stood her ground. Today, her name lives on, given to craters on the moon, 2 asteroids, and 2 universities. Her image, a woman with a scroll in hand, eyes lifted toward the stars, has become a symbol of endless curiosity and silent courage. And in every person who dares to ask why, in every student who lights a candle late into the night, In every woman who steps into spaces once forbidden, there is a flicker of Hypatia's light. She was not the last of an age. She was the bridge between the ancient and the modern, between darkness and light, between fear and hope. As the night draws to a close, remember this. There was once a woman, in the storm of history, who lit a candle and said, "We must think." And that light will never fade. Hypatia was not only a victim of fanaticism, she was a symbol of light. In a time of deep darkness, her death serves as a quiet reminder of the true worth of knowledge and of independent thought. Her legacy still lives on, inspiring generation after generation of those who love truth and who dare to seek it. Tonight's story comes to a close. If your eyes have gently shut, then I wish you a deep, peaceful sleep until we meet again in the next dream.